September 1939. Warsaw. The American embassy sat on a Lage Ujazdowski like a fortress of neutrality in a city holding its breath. Inside, the air smelled of cigarette smoke, old leather, and something else, something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. Fear, maybe. Or the residue of too many sleepless nights. John Whitman had been the deputy cultural attaché for 11 months. Long enough to know the names of the street vendors outside. Long enough to recognize the rhythm of Warsaw's mornings, the trams, the church bells, the pigeons that gathered near the fountain. Long enough to understand that everything he'd learned about diplomacy in Washington meant nothing here. He stood at the window on the third floor, watching the street below. A woman pushed a pram. An old man carried a loaf of bread under his arm. A boy kicked a stone along the sidewalk. Normal. Except nothing was normal anymore. Behind him, the teletype machine clattered. Another message from Berlin. Another denial. Another assurance that Germany sought only peace, only what was rightfully theirs, only a corridor through Polish territory to reach Danzig. Whitman had stopped believing the messages 3 weeks ago. He'd been in Poland since October 1938. Sent to strengthen cultural ties between America and the newly vulnerable nation. What that really meant was, watch, listen, report. Don't interfere. Don't take sides. America wasn't interested in another European war. Not after the last one. But Whitman had taken sides the moment he'd met Tomasz Kowalski. Tomasz was a translator at the embassy, a thin man in his early 30s with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that never stopped moving when he spoke. He'd studied literature at Jagiellonian University in Krakow before the economy collapsed. Now he translated cables, visa applications, and the desperate pleas of Polish Jews trying to get their families out before the borders closed for good. Tomasz had a sister in Krakow. A wife and infant daughter here in Warsaw. And a question he asked Whitman every morning. Do you think they'll really come? For weeks, Whitman had offered the diplomatic answer, we're monitoring the situation closely. But this morning, August 31st, Tomasz hadn't asked. He'd simply looked at Whitman with eyes that already knew. The Wehrmacht had been massing troops along the border for days. Whitman had seen the intelligence reports. Entire divisions. Panzer units. Luftwaffe squadrons positioned within striking distance of Polish airfields. The German press screamed about Polish aggression, about attacks on German citizens, about the need for decisive action. It was all theater. Whitman knew it. Tomasz knew it. Everyone in Warsaw knew it. What they didn't know was when. Whitman turned from the window and walked down the narrow corridor to the communications room. The teletype operator, a young man named Davies, looked up as he entered. Anything new? Whitman asked. Davies shook his head. Same as yesterday. Berlin says negotiations are ongoing. London says they're prepared to honor their treaty obligations. Paris says the same. But nobody's doing anything. And from our people? Ambassador Biddle is meeting with Polish Foreign Minister Beck this afternoon. He's been instructed to express American concern but to make no commitments. Whitman nodded. No commitments. That was the American position in a single phrase. He walked back to his office, a cramped room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a map of Europe pinned to the wall. He'd marked the German positions in red. The Polish defensive lines in blue. The gap between them was shrinking every day. There was a knock at the door. Come in. Tomasz entered, carrying a stack of documents. His face was pale. These just came in, he said quietly. Visa applications. 73 families. All Jewish. All from Lodz and Poznan. Whitman took the stack and flipped through the pages. Names. Addresses. Occupations. Children's birth dates. Photographs clipped to the forms, faces staring into the camera with expressions that ranged from hope to resignation. How many can we approve? Tomasz asked. Whitman set the stack on his desk. You know the quota system. We're already over the limit for this year. Then next year. There might not be a next year, Tomasz. The words hung in the air between them. Tomasz removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. My wife wants to leave. She wants to take our daughter and go to her cousin in Vilnius. But I told her to wait. I told her the Americans wouldn't let this happen. That there would be consequences. That Hitler was bluffing. Whitman said nothing. I was wrong, wasn't I? I don't know. Yes, you do. Whitman looked at the map on the wall. At the red marks creeping closer to the blue lines. At the distance between Warsaw and the German border. Less than 200 miles. The Luftwaffe could cover that in under an hour. Send your wife to Vilnius, Whitman said. Tonight if you can. Tomasz nodded slowly. He put his glasses back on and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. What about you? Will you leave? I'm American. They won't touch the embassy. And if they do? Whitman didn't answer. That evening, Whitman walked through the streets of Warsaw. The city was quieter than usual. Fewer people in the cafes. Fewer cars on the roads. Sandbags had appeared around government buildings. Anti-aircraft guns were being positioned in the parks. He stopped at a small church near the old town. Inside, a dozen people knelt in prayer. Candles flickered in the alcoves. An old priest moved between the pews, murmuring blessings. Whitman wasn't religious, but he sat in the back row anyway. The silence felt heavier here. More honest. A woman entered and knelt 2 rows ahead. She crossed herself and began to pray in Polish. Her voice was soft, but Whitman caught fragments. Protect my sons, give US strength, let this pass. He thought about Tomasz's daughter. About the 73 families in the visa applications. About all the people in this city who were praying for something that might not come. When he left the church, the sun was setting. The sky over Warsaw was the color of rust. Back at the embassy, Whitman found a message waiting on his desk. It was from Ambassador Biddle. Foreign Minister Beck confirms German ultimatum rejected. Polish government will not yield Corridor or Danzig. Prepare for possible evacuation of non-essential personnel. Further instructions to follow. Whitman read the message twice, then folded it and placed it in his desk drawer. He sat in the dark office for a long time, listening to the sounds of the city outside. The distant hum of trams. The bark of a dog. The laughter of someone walking past. Normal sounds. The last normal sounds. Because somewhere across the border, in the forests of East Prussia and Silesia, hundreds of thousands of men were climbing into trucks and tanks. Pilots were checking their instruments. Artillery crews were loading shells. And in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was signing the order. Whitman didn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk, watching the clock. Watching the minutes crawl toward midnight. Toward September 1st. Toward the moment when everything would change. At 4:45 a.m., the first bombs fell on Warsaw. The first explosion came from the east. Whitman was still at his desk when the windows rattled. A low, rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He stood and moved to the window. The sky was still dark, but there were flashes on the horizon, brief, white bursts that lit the clouds from below. Then the sirens started. Within minutes, the streets filled with people. Some ran. Others stood frozen, staring up at the sky. A woman screamed. A child cried. Some were close, glass shattered. Whitman grabbed his coat and ran down the stairs. The embassy lobby was chaos. Staff members rushed between offices. Phones rang unanswered. Ambassador Biddle emerged from his office, his face drawn but composed. Everyone to the basement, he ordered. Now. Whitman pushed through the crowd and out the front door. He had to find Tomasz. The streets were pandemonium. People poured from apartment buildings, some still in nightclothes. A tram sat abandoned in the middle of the road, its doors open. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire from the park, their tracers arcing into the darkness. And then he heard them. The planes. A low drone that grew louder, closer. Whitman looked up and saw them, dark shapes moving against the pre-dawn sky. Dozens of them. Maybe more. They flew in formation, methodical, unhurried. The bombs fell like rain. The first hit 3 blocks away. The concussion knocked Whitman sideways into a doorway. His ears rang. Dust and smoke filled the air. When he looked up, flames were climbing the side of an apartment building. People stumbled out, coughing, bleeding. He ran. Tomasz lived in a small apartment near the Vistula River, 15 minutes on foot. Whitman covered the distance in 8, dodging rubble and broken glass. Another wave of bombers passed overhead. More explosions. A building collapsed 2 streets over, the sound like the earth splitting open. When he reached Tomasz's building, the front door was open. He took the stairs 2 at a time to the 3rd floor and pounded on the door. Tomasz. It's Whitman. No answer. He tried the handle. Locked. Tomasz. The door opened. Tomasz stood there, pale, holding his infant daughter against his chest. Behind him, his wife, Eva, was stuffing clothes into a suitcase with shaking hands. "We're leaving," Tomasz said. "Right now." "Good. Where?" "The train station. There's a train to Vilnius at 6. Whitman checked his watch. 5:20 a.m. "You'll never make it. The streets are." Another explosion, closer this time. The building shook. Plaster dust fell from the ceiling. The baby began to cry. Eva looked at Whitman, her eyes wide. "Please. Help us." Whitman nodded. "Come with me. The embassy has cars." They moved through the streets like ghosts through a nightmare. Buildings burned. Bodies lay in the rubble. A horse, still harnessed to an overturned cart, thrashed and screamed. No one stopped to help it. The bombers came in waves. Every few minutes, the drone of engines, the whistle of falling bombs, the crack of explosions. Whitman kept them moving, 1 block at a time, staying close to the buildings, ducking into doorways when the planes passed overhead. Eva carried the baby. Tomasz carried the suitcase. Whitman led the way. They were 2 blocks from the embassy when the Stuka dive bombers arrived. The sound was different, a high-pitched scream that seemed to pierce straight through the skull. Whitman looked up and saw them dropping out of the sky at impossible angles, their sirens wailing. "Run!" he shouted. They ran. The bombs hit the street behind them. The blast lifted Whitman off his feet and slammed him into a wall. His vision went white. His ears filled with a high-pitched whine. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the ground. Smoke everywhere. Flames. Screaming. He pushed himself up. His left arm wouldn't move right, something wrong with the shoulder. He ignored it. Tomasz. Through the smoke, he saw them. Tomasz was on his knees, coughing. Eva was on the ground, clutching the baby. The suitcase lay open in the street, clothes scattered across the cobblestones. Whitman stumbled over and helped Tomasz to his feet. "Can you walk?" Tomasz nodded, gasping. Eva was crying, but she was moving. The baby was screaming, a good sign. Alive. They left the suitcase and kept moving. The embassy was in lockdown when they arrived. Marines stood at the entrance with rifles. Whitman showed his identification and pushed through with Tomasz and his family. Inside, the basement was packed. Embassy staff, American citizens, a handful of foreign nationals who'd sought refuge. The air was thick and hot. Someone had set up a radio in the corner, and a crackling voice reported the situation in Polish. German forces have crossed the border at multiple points, heavy fighting reported near Wielin, Częstochowa, and the Westerplatte. Polish forces are engaging, the government calls on all citizens to remain calm. Whitman found a corner for Tomasz and his family. Ava sat on the floor, rocking the baby. Tomasz stood beside them, staring at nothing. "You're safe here," Whitman said. Tomasz looked at him. "For how long?" Whitman didn't answer. The bombing continued for hours. The building shook. The lights flickered. In the basement, people prayed, wept, or sat in silence. Some tried to sleep. Most couldn't. Whitman made his way to the communications room. Davies was still at the teletype, his face gray with exhaustion. "Anything from Washington?" Whitman asked. "Statement from the president. Expresses deep concern. Calls for immediate cessation of hostilities. Reaffirms American neutrality." "That's it?" "That's it." Whitman leaned against the wall. Outside, the city was burning. Inside, they were typing messages about neutrality. Davies looked up. "There's something else. From our military attaché. He's been monitoring German radio traffic. They're not just bombing Warsaw. They're hitting every major city. Krakow, Lodz, Poznan, Gdynia. Airfields, rail stations, bridges. Everything." "What about the Polish army?" "Fighting. But they're outgunned. The Germans have air superiority. Tanks. Mechanized infantry. The Poles are still using cavalry in some sectors. Cavalry against tanks." Whitman closed his eyes. "How long?" he asked. "Until what?" "Until it's over." Davies was quiet for a moment. "Then, weeks. Maybe less." By midday, the bombing had slowed. The Luftwaffe had moved on to other targets. Warsaw burned, but the immediate assault had passed. Whitman returned to the basement. Tomasz was sitting with his back against the wall, his daughter asleep in his arms. Ava had fallen asleep beside him, her head on his shoulder. Whitman sat down next to him. "The train to Vilnius," Tomasz said quietly. "It never left, did it?" "No." "And the roads?" "Blocked. Or bombed. Or full of refugees." Tomasz nodded slowly. He looked down at his daughter, tiny, perfect, unaware. "I should have sent them yesterday," he said. "When you told me to. You couldn't have known." "Yes, I could. We all could." They sat in silence. Around them, the basement hummed with whispered conversations, muffled sobs, the static of the radio. Then Tomasz spoke again, his voice barely audible. "What happens now?" Whitman looked at the ceiling, at the cracks in the plaster, at the dust still falling. "Now," he said, "we wait." That night, Whitman stood at the embassy window again. The city was dark, power lines cut, streetlights shattered. But fires still burned across Warsaw, casting an orange glow against the low clouds. He thought about the 73 visa applications still sitting on his desk. About the families who'd applied, hoping for escape. About where they were now. If they were still alive. He thought about Tomasz's question, what happens now? The answer was simple. Brutal. Inevitable. Now, the world would watch Poland fall. Britain and France would issue statements. America would express concern. And none of it would matter. Because at 4:45 that morning, when the first bombs fell on Warsaw, the equation had changed. The waiting was over. The war had begun. And there was no going back. September 17th, 1939. 16 days. That's how long it took for the world John Whitman knew to collapse. The embassy was still standing, but barely. The windows on the north side were blown out. Shrapnel scars marked the limestone facade. The American flag still flew from the roof, a small act of defiance that meant less with each passing day. Warsaw was dying. Not all at once. Not in a single catastrophic moment. But slowly, methodically, like a body bleeding out. The water supply had failed on the 5th day. Electricity came and went. Food was rationed. The hospitals overflowed with wounded. The dead were buried in parks, in gardens, wherever there was space. And still, the city fought. Whitman had watched it happen. The Polish army, outgunned and outmaneuvered, had retreated toward Warsaw. The government had fled east. But the soldiers stayed. The civilians stayed. They built barricades. They dug trenches. They fired rifles at German tanks. It was brave. It was futile. And it was about to get worse. Whitman stood in Ambassador Biddle's office. The ambassador looked like he'd aged 10 years in 16 days. His suit was rumpled. His eyes were bloodshot. A map of Poland covered his desk, marked with red and blue pins. Most of the pins were red now. The Soviets crossed the border this morning, Biddle said. His voice was flat, drained of emotion. From the east. Multiple divisions. They're calling it a liberation of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. Whitman stared at the map. At the red pins advancing from the west. At the new threat coming from the east. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, he said quietly. Biddle nodded. They carved up Poland before the war even started. We suspected, but now it's confirmed. Germany takes the west. The Soviets take the east. Poland ceases to exist. What about the Polish government? Crossed into Romania last night. They're trying to establish a government in exile. But for all practical purposes. Biddle gestured at the map. It's over. Whitman felt something cold settle in his chest. Not surprise. He'd known this was coming. They'd all known. But knowing and seeing were different things. What are our orders? He asked. Washington wants us to evacuate. All non-essential personnel. Within 48 hours. And the Poles who've taken refuge here. Biddle was quiet for a long moment. Then, we can't take them. Neutrality laws. If we evacuate foreign nationals, we risk being seen as taking sides. We are taking sides. We're just not admitting it. That's not our decision to make, John. Whitman looked at the ambassador. At the exhaustion in his face. At the weight of impossible choices. What about Tomasz? Whitman asked. He's worked for us for almost a year. He's translated classified documents. If the Germans find him. I know. I've sent a request to Washington. Special visa. Humanitarian grounds. But I can't promise anything. Whitman nodded. He knew what that meant. No promises. No commitments. The American position in 2 sentences. He found Tomasz in the basement. The translator was sitting on a cot, his daughter asleep in his arms. Ava was gone. She'd volunteered at a makeshift hospital 3 blocks away, helping with the wounded. Tomasz looked up as Whitman approached. He didn't ask. He already knew. The Soviets, Tomasz said. It wasn't a question. Yes. So we're surrounded. Yes. Tomasz looked down at his daughter. She was sleeping peacefully, her tiny hand curled against his chest. Unaware that the world around her was ending. The embassy is evacuating, Whitman said. In 2 days. I'm trying to get you and your family on the list, but we're Polish. I'm working on it. Tomasz smiled, a sad, exhausted smile that didn't reach his eyes. You know what's strange, he said. 3 weeks ago, I was translating a cultural exchange proposal. American jazz musicians coming to Warsaw. Polish folk dancers going to New York. We were planning concerts. Exhibitions. Building bridges. He paused, looking around the basement at the huddled refugees, the makeshift beds, the flickering candles. And now this. Whitman sat down beside him. I'm sorry. For what? You didn't start this war. No. But I didn't stop it either. Could you have? Whitman thought about the visa applications on his desk. About the 73 families. About the diplomatic cables that went unanswered. About the meetings where nothing was decided. "No," he said finally. "I couldn't have." They sat in silence. Above them, the building creaked. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. Then Tomasz spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know what I keep thinking about? That morning, August 31st, when you told me to send my wife to Vilnius. I almost did. I had the tickets. I had everything ready. But then I thought, what if I'm wrong? What if this is all just posturing? What if I send them away and nothing happens?" He looked at Whitman, his eyes red. "I chose wrong. You chose to hope. That's not wrong. It is when hope gets your family killed." Whitman had no answer for that. The next morning, Whitman walked through Warsaw one last time. The city was unrecognizable. Entire blocks reduced to rubble. Craters in the streets. Buildings gutted by fire. The smell of smoke and death hung in the air like a fog. But people were still moving. Still living. An old woman swept debris from her doorstep. A man carried water from a broken pipe. Children played in the ruins, their laughter strange and defiant. Whitman stopped at the church where he'd sat on the night before the invasion. The roof was gone. The walls were pocked with bullet holes. But inside, the old priest was still there, kneeling before the altar. Whitman stepped inside. The priest looked up. "You're leaving," the priest said in English. Not a question. "Yes." The priest nodded. "You should. There's nothing more you can do here." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. You came. You witnessed. That matters." "Does it?" The priest was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, his joints creaking. "There's a story," he said, "about a man who sees a house on fire. He can't put out the fire. He can't save everyone inside. But he runs in anyway and carries out one child. Just one. And someone asks him, why? Why save one when so many will die? And he says, because to that one child, it matters." The priest placed a hand on Whitman's shoulder. "You saved your friend. His family. That matters." Whitman wanted to believe him. But when he looked at the ruined church, at the destroyed city, at the thousands who wouldn't be saved, it felt like nothing. September 19th, 6 a.m. The convoy assembled outside the embassy. 3 cars. 12 people. American flags mounted on the hoods. Whitman stood beside the lead car, checking the route one last time. They'd drive south, toward the Romanian border. It would take 2 days, maybe 3. The roads were clogged with refugees. German and Soviet forces controlled most of the major routes. But they had diplomatic papers. Neutrality, for what it was worth. Ambassador Biddle emerged from the embassy, carrying a briefcase. Behind him came the staff, secretaries, clerks, the Marine Guards. And at the end, Tomasz, carrying his daughter. Ava walked beside him, her face pale but determined. Whitman felt something loosen in his chest. The visa had come through. At the last possible moment, Washington had approved it. Special circumstances. Humanitarian grounds. One family. Out of millions. Tomasz stopped in front of Whitman. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Tomasz extended his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. Whitman shook his hand. "Get your family to safety. That's all that matters now." Tomasz nodded. He started to turn away, then stopped. "What will you do after this?" Whitman looked back at the embassy. At the American flag still flying above the ruins. "I'll go home," he said. "And I'll tell them what I saw here. What happened. Maybe it won't change anything. But at least they'll know. And if they don't listen, then I'll tell them again. And again." Until they do. Tomasz smiled, a real smile this time, small but genuine. Then maybe hope isn't dead after all. The convoy left at 6:30 a.m. Whitman sat in the back of the second car, watching Warsaw disappear through the rear window. The city was still burning. The smoke rose in black columns against the morning sky. He thought about the 73 families. About the visa applications still sitting on his desk. About all the people who wouldn't make it out. He thought about the priest's story. About saving one when you couldn't save them all. And he thought about Tomasz's question, what happens now? The answer was different than it had been 16 days ago. Now, the world knew what Hitler was capable of. What war in the modern age looked like. The speed. The brutality. The totality of destruction. Britain and France had declared war on Germany. But they hadn't sent troops. Hadn't bombed German cities. Hadn't done anything except issue statements. They were still waiting. Still hoping diplomacy would work. Still believing this could be contained. But Whitman knew better. He'd seen the equation change. He'd watched it happen in real time. On September 1st, at 4:45 a.m., when the first bombs fell on Warsaw, the old world had ended. The world of treaties and negotiations and carefully worded statements. The world where wars were fought by rules. That world was gone. And in its place was something new. Something darker. A war that wouldn't stop at borders. That wouldn't spare civilians. That wouldn't end until one side or the other was destroyed. Whitman looked at Tomasz, sitting in the front seat with his daughter asleep against his chest. One family saved. One small victory in an ocean of loss. It wasn't enough. But it was something. And right now, something was all they had. The convoy reached the Romanian border 3 days later. The crossing took hours, paperwork, inspections, negotiations. But eventually, the barrier lifted. As they drove through, Whitman looked back one last time at Poland. At the country that no longer existed. At the people still trapped inside. He made himself a promise. He would go home. He would write his report. He would tell everyone who would listen what he'd seen. Not because it would change the past, but because it might change the future. Because somewhere, in some other city, in some other country, another diplomat would face the same choice he'd faced. The same question. What happens now? And maybe, just maybe, they would choose differently. Maybe they would act instead of wait. Maybe they would save more than one family. Maybe they would stop the next war before it started. It was a small hope. A fragile hope. But it was hope nonetheless. And in September 1939, as the world burned, hope was the only thing left worth fighting for.